Hi, and welcome to Speaking of Faith, occasional conversations about faith, life, and so much in between. I have the great pleasure of being joined today by Wright Marsh, who is the Director of Theological Horizons, which is an organization that supports Christians and seekers in academia by providing a welcoming community near University of Virginia in Charlottesville, Virginia. Thank you so much for being with us today.
It's my pleasure. It's great to be with you.
So this first time I want to talk about a recent book that you published called Vintage Saints and Sinners, 25 Christians Who Transformed My Faith. Now, I know that several groups around First Presbyterian Church are using this book and are reading it or have already read it. And I wonder if you could just tell me a little bit more about the book and why you chose to write it.
Well, I didn't grow up talking about saints, so it was sort of an unexpected path, but I work with students at the University of Virginia. And for about 18 years, we've had a lunch every Friday. It's a homemade lunch. Bring them into the Bonhoeffer House, so cool. Feed them, which is the main attraction. But I've just learned that telling stories about spiritual experience is so powerful. In the university setting, it's a very heady space. There's a lot of contested ideas and points of view and doctrine and dogma. But I just started telling them stories of Christians who've lived in the past. And we've gone from Augustine to Mother Teresa to Dorothy Day. Some we know, some we don't know. And after 18 years of telling these stories, I just had to write them down and share them.
Yeah, so it emerged from a sort of a lunch and connections around stories. That's awesome. Laura Winner is someone that folks who watch this may recognize her name, but she wrote the foreword to your book. Yeah. And she says to the readers of your book that readers should sort of be attentive to their reactions to the various saints that you survey to see which ones are of particular interest and which ones are perhaps not. And I'm wondering, after you've written it, after these 18 years of conversations, if there are one or two saints that you are just so drawn to, you would write another book for, and why that might be the case.
Yeah. I love Lauren's introduction because she even says, right, watch out for the ones that really challenge and disturb you because they're probably the ones you need to hear from.
Yeah, right.
But there are so many that I love. But Sophie Scholl, to me, is a story that I return to again and again. She was 21 when she died, resisting Hitler, she and her brother. And she reminds me of my daughter, my children who are 21. And for the students in the room at lunch, I look into their faces and I say, Sophie did this thing. She stood up for justice, and would you do the same? Yeah. So I have a motherly affection for her. I love Brother Lawrence because he was completely unprepared and unequipped to be a saint. So there's hope for me and for all of us. But he lived in the kitchen of the convent, of the monastery, washing the dishes, the pots and the pans, and learned to experience God's presence. I love his quote, one is not a saint all of a sudden. Yeah. So he really encourages me in my life when I'm washing the dishes and driving the kids around and just going about my life. I love a new one I found, Mabel Lee, who was a young woman who was born in China, grew up in New York, and became this incredible pastor in Chinatown. So, the more I read these stories, the more friends I have in the faith.
Yeah, oh, that's awesome. I love that. Mm-hmm. So now the counter to the question, what about a couple of people you wrote about or maybe didn't write about who you're maybe a little less drawn to?
Yeah, I think there are two, I sort of am turned off for two reasons. The first would be because I really feel inadequate and it sort of touches this place in me. Dorothy Day is definitely one of them because she says, if you have two coats in your closet, one belongs to a poor person. Yeah. And I'm like, oops. Yeah. I mean, she's so incredibly committed to mercy and justice and kindness, and she stood up for what was right. So I'm in awe of her. I admire her.
But it's almost too high of a bar.
Yeah, I mean, I could never be Dorothy Day, but in fact, I could. I just don't choose to do what she did. Yeah. And that's just a hard thing to admit. Yeah. Now, there's another story in the book of A.W. Tozer, who was one of my grandmother's favorite, great Bible teacher, early 20th century. And when I got into his story, I met a man who was not a good husband, who was not a good attentive father, who put God ahead of his family, right, in front of everything. And when I first read his biography, I said to my husband, Charles, I don't think I can include this person in my book. And Charles said, well, you really have to now. He's so much more interesting.
Exactly.
So, it kind of raised this question, when the personal side of the person is a disappointment, can you follow the words that they speak or the teaching that they bring? Yeah. I don't know the answer to that. Yeah. I did include Tozer. Yeah. I think I realized that my grandmother who loved him was the real saint. Yeah. And it really challenged me to think about even what is a saint.
Yeah. And I love how your grandmother mediated that sainthood even to you.
She really did.
Saved him for the book.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's great. And actually, your conversation or your answer just now about Dorothy Day sort of ties into my next question, which is, you ask people throughout the book to really reconsider what it means to be a saint, because I think our preconceived notion is that saints are the small group of the spiritually and religiously elite, and in many ways, your book challenges that. And so I wonder if you could just say more about what you hope folks will take away from your book about what it means to be a saint, and what sainthood is after they've worked through your book.
Right. I mean, the word saint is problematic from the first. And I've come, again, through telling these stories, always looking for the human angle, to see saints in a much broader light. As brothers and sisters, as mentors, as guides in the faith. I think that saints, by my understanding, my growing sort of definition, is that a saint is a person who sees the world as it is, who is in the world, and yet sees beyond. Somehow has come through God's grace and God's work in their lives to see the bigger story, to see God's goodness, to see the deeper, more meaningful life of the Spirit that is all around us. There's someone who says that saints are like physicists, atomic physicists who see the surfaces and yet see the atomic realities, kind of the micro realities or the bigger realities. Yeah. So that's what I'm working with. And I do think for all of us, the more saints we get to know, and the better, the bigger, the more generous our definition is, the more we can see that we have a space in that story. And that, one does not become a saint all of a sudden. Yeah. And it's a process, it's a journey. I love the language of pilgrimage.
Yeah, I love that language of pilgrimage because sometimes it feels like there's a linear straight line, and the people of Israel, it's almost like that wandering around in the wilderness, that we set out for this, but that doesn't mean that there's not going to be jogs back and forth.
Absolutely.
And it's a lifetime journey. But
one story, or one approach I often take is when I tell the story of a saint who we know as this super spiritual athlete. I look for what they were doing when they were 18 to 21, because I'm with undergraduates. Yeah. And I'm like, if you could have seen Thomas Merton, he got kicked out of Cambridge for very bad behavior, or Augustine, of course, is the classic bad boy. Yeah. C.S. Lewis, who said Christianity is for idiots. Yeah. When you look at the whole story, there's often a lot of back and forth and ups and downs.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for this conversation, and thank you for joining us in this new installment of Speaking of Faith. We hope you'll join us for future videos.